A lot of people hate going to the dentist, especially when they find out they have cavities that need to be drilled and filled. But did you know that dental cavities can be reversed if they're detected early? I had no idea until I met today's guest. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. My guest today is Jordan Rubinson, CEO of CaviSense, which focuses on detection of early stage cavities. If you like this show, please subscribe and leave a review. Jordan, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thank you for having me on, David. A pleasure to be here.
Well, we're going to talk about a lot of things related to what you're doing now, but I want to wind back the clock and ask you about your childhood. What was your childhood like? What any influences from your childhood that have stuck with you in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess as we'll talk. I mean, I've had a wild and very diverse career, in the sort of medical technology and pharmaceutical industry. I think what really got me interested to it was my father, actually, who sadly just passed away, but was 30 years in the same company, one of those sort of classic guys who had the same job in the same company for 30 years. It used to be called Block Drug Company, and then they got bought out. They make the Sensodyne toothpaste.
Nice.
They eventually got bought out by GSK, and he ultimately retired. But it was there that I got my first taste of the pharmaceutical industry. He was more on the accounting side, less on the business side. But
yeah,
I guess you can't help but be influenced by your parents and their career choices.
Makes sense. So I saw you went to Columbia as an undergrad, and then the Sloan School. What was that? What was that like?
So I went to Columbia. I have to say I did a little too much partying, considering it was an Ivy League school. I was in the engineering school. So it was kind of like burning the candle at both ends. You've got a very tough, technical curriculum on the one hand, and then you've got fraternities. I was on the basketball team, rugby team, and so I kind of wanted to experience both ends of undergrad. But I was able to make up for it, and had a really sort of more sort of traditional sort of academic education at MIT. It wasn't the party school like Harvard down the river. It was get in, get out, do your bit, and learn as much as you can, and more of a classic sort of academic experience.
I heard about people who were partying in high school and then they straightened out in college, but you took it an extra level, and well, you got your degree and you got good enough to to get into the next place. So
true. I didn't suffer too badly, but you're right. At a certain point, I did grow up and take a life a lot more seriously.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess it's not for everyone, but it's good that you took a serious path at one point. So a lot of your early career I saw was in big pharma, and you answered one of my questions a little bit when you talked about your dad and having at least some sort of knowledge about pharma. But how did you get into that space in the first place in the pharma market?
When I was in business school, right, you look around you at everybody else, and everybody's trying to decide what do they want to do after business school. And of course, there's this influx of opportunities with consulting firms and investment banks and so forth. And that's like you just hear the sucking sound, that everybody's sort of moving in that direction. And for some reason, I understood that wasn't the path that I wanted. I was more of a sort of blue collar guy. I wanted to be in companies, doing the work myself. I had an internship actually at Owens Corning in Toledo, Ohio. And, we're making fiberglass insulation in factories. I thought I was going to be a manufacturing guy. And then I, kind of got to think, I was like, look, if you have a choice of industries, which thankfully I did, right, you might as well pick something where you could do some good, where your life has more meaning. Obviously, it was a very simplistic, sort of view of the healthcare industry, but that's sort of what drove me into it. And I haven't regretted it, to be honest.
In my experience working with big pharma, people travel around a lot, but you seem to, move countries a lot. Just not just you got off the plane and you stayed there for a while early on. Was that an explicit desire at the start of your career to go and shift around from location to location?
So it was actually a desire from me. It actually stemmed from my wife, who grew up in a variety of different countries. Her father was the head of one of these student exchange programs, so they kind of were moved around in that way. And I think she kind of either wanted to replicate it or liked something about moving countries. But I joined originally with I guess pharmaceutical companies get gobbled up all the time. So the group that I joined was called Pasteur Mérieux Canot. It was a section of Aventis, now what is Aventis, essentially in their vaccine division. And they had that was in the period of like the management development programs, where they would move people around sort of systematically to give them a bird's eye view of a variety of different sort of functional areas in the company. And so they had that twist where they had just merged companies from France, Canada, and the United States. And they wanted to educate some of their new leaders and give them experiences in a variety of cultures and countries to be able to knit the newly formed company, better together. So that's what they did. Is they structured a program. It was like every 9 months, I moved not only function but country, and that just continued not only with Aventis, but when I went to GSK afterwards. I was about 5 years in Philly, and then they decided that they liked what I was doing and wanted to promote me and give me some exceptional opportunities, and really asked me where in the world I wanted to go. And so, we got moved again, to France and then ultimately to Israel. So I feel like, we kind of got in that cycle, partly voluntarily, but partly because of, just the opportunities that presented themselves.
I remember doing work on the post-merger integration of Glaxo, Wellcome, and SmithKline Beecham, and you looked at these sort of like the big countries and then the medium countries and the small countries, and all these, working groups. One I remember is they were trying to assign the sales force, and they said, who's going to take the stands? Like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan. They were all sort of like grouped together, and I was like, okay, those all they were not necessarily small countries actually, but small economies. But what's the observation about big pharma in big countries, medium countries, small countries? What did you feel? What did you learn? What did you feel about that?
So I think there's a couple of elements to this. One is look, in big countries, I think the U.S. is fairly unique, right? Because it's just so dominant, in the global pharmaceutical geography, and just financially powers the pharmaceutical industry. So there are just so many more people and so many more jobs, and that means that every job obviously has an additional significance to it in terms of the value that it provides the overall company, but I think also they tend to be more narrow, so you could be, I don't know, on a team of people in a single sort of product management team where you're doing only, sort of professional medical education or, some sort of or market research for a product team. And, I think there's a depth to the job, but then, and also, the impact that you have, because each of these brands are potentially billion-dollar brands, which obviously are really important for the overall company, and then you drop down to a medium-sized country. And so again, it's like almost like a factor of 10 in terms of the overall revenue generation, likewise, the number of people they have. But what you get instead is a broader, job, because they simply have, a tenth of the people who are supposed to do the same promotional efforts, that the U.S. teams do. So you may have multiple products, and you can't afford yourself, such a large team, and so everybody on the team has to wear, many more hats. And then you take it to the further extreme, and you go to a small country like Israel, which does a tiny fraction of the sales. And so there I was actually the marketing director for all of Israel. So I had, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 product managers under me, each of which had a therapeutic area, but I was responsible for the entire portfolio at the time of Pfizer, and so I was diving deep into every product. And so you have to think at such a fast pace and a diverse level, whereas in the US, I was a product manager for one single vaccine, and then suddenly I was, at Pfizer, and I had every therapeutic area and every product that Pfizer was promoting under my direction.
So you mentioned ending up in Israel with big pharma, but then, what they have in Israel is a lot of Medtech players. So you don't have a ton, you have some pharma, but the more of the startups are more on the, on the device technologies, software side of things. So what was the transition like for you going from pharma, dealing with molecules, to these startups, of which you worked for multiple ones in Israel.
Yeah, I mean it's it's a huge study in contrasts. When you're in big pharma, and a lot of people, I think because I've watched people try to make the transition from big pharma to a startup, and you just get used to this big organization with all kinds of emails and meetings all day long, and also the resources. Everybody's got their sort of admin. You can fly almost anywhere, anytime you want. If you have the proper justification. I mean, the resources are seemingly endless. And then you go to a startup company, and everything is like an existential crisis. Especially the ones in Israel, right? I mean, you can go to a nice startup in the United States that's well capitalized and find again a fair amount of resources. But in Israel, they tend not to have the same amount of funding that you get in the United States with startups, and so everything is on a tight budget. Your investors keep you on a short leash, and it's a huge transformation that not everybody is either willing to or wanting to make. But having said that, we talked about the scope earlier about some of the jobs and the sizes. When you're in a startup, I mean, everybody is wearing multiple hats, and you're no longer just sort of the marketing guy, but you're the chief commercial officer that's responsible for sales. You're not just responsible for sales in one country; you're responsible for sales all over the world. I've been the CEO on several occasions, and so again, you've got this massive sort of weight in your shoulders. And so it's a very different sort of atmosphere, and like I said, a lot of people have a lot of difficulty in making that transition.
So Jordan, you move around from one company to the next in different therapeutic areas and technologies, and again, maybe that's just indicative of what the scene is like there. You don't have 100 companies all doing something that's different flavors of those like you might have in the U.S. But say a little bit about your own journey and maybe mention some of the specific companies that you helped to lead there.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, because again, in pharma, I mean, you do make a nice salary and the compensation and the benefits, but there's really no upside at the end of the day. And so, when I was in Israel, one of the large sort of VC companies in the medical area approached me and asked me if I wanted to be the CEO of one of their daughter companies. And they made me a proposal where the compensation, annual compensation was virtually the same of what I was making over at Pharma. And then they said, look, we'll also give you, 5 or 10% of the company. And I was like, okay, I hadn't really thought about this, as a career path, but, if you just sort of do the math, it makes a lot of sense, or at least it did at the time. And so I quickly became a CEO of a company. Thankfully, I had a lot of, guidance at the time, but I'm a sort of a commercial CEO. So, I mean, there's some of the, people in the scientific world who come in early stage at these companies and will stay with a company, 5 or 10 years. Israel doesn't have a lot of sort of like pharmaceutical or biotech. Those are really few and far between because of the sustained, effort and the financing required to bring a drug to market. But they really do well in the device area, the diagnostics, the digital health, and things like that, where the path is a lot shorter, the money requirements, investment requirements are a lot smaller. So I tend to get involved as the company is sort of approaching the commercialization, to do the product market fit, to bring it to market. If I'm the CEO, obviously to raise capital, and ultimately, what Israeli companies do very well is exit. So they don't tend to really invest in the company, to maturation and to make it a large company. Rather, they look for, the first opportunity to sort of sell out. Some of them, at high valuations, some of them at lower valuations. But that seemed to be like the cyclical or, serial entrepreneurs that just start up and sell off companies rather than building, real infrastructure and larger companies. And so I cycled through every 2 or 3 years, different therapeutic areas. And as you mentioned, you don't have the luxury in Israel. It's a growing, developed ecosystem with a lot of great technologies, but not enough that you can focus on a field of oncology or cardiology, and or technology such as ultrasound or whatnot. So I ended up, traveling through a number of these. My first was in wound healing which lasted about 2 or 3 years and was sold over to Teva Pharmaceuticals. That they had an interest in wound healing at the time. And then I got involved with some American colleagues of mine in oncology, which had both applications for both clinical and research, and a company called Champions Oncology, which is and continues to be listed on the NASDAQ and doing very well. And you kind of skip around and get pulled into things once one chapter ends. It's a lot about, the network that you build up and the people that you know and have worked with who pull you into their next venture. And that's kind of how things went. And so I was then the CEO of a drug development company in the field of CNS, which is probably my only failure. And I swore off drug development afterwards because of the risks associated with it. But then I got pulled in by an investor into what I think is the gem of what I've done is a company called Pulsamore. And they have an at-home ultrasound, and they've started for pregnant women to be able to see, babies' heartbeats and movements and so forth, while at home, and getting advice online from physicians. It's really a remarkable story. And, my first opportunity in digital health, which is obviously very well suited to sort of Israel, which is sort of at the nexus of medical and IT, which they're both very good at. And then finally, I got into another company called Xtrodes, which does, these dry printed electrodes that you can paste all over your body and get all kinds of various different signals. So it has applications in sleep and cardiology, which was interesting. And then, as you can see, the stark contrast, it's no great surprise that I, kind of found myself in the world of dentistry and dental technology.
Exactly. So I was going to say there's, in some ways, back to your roots, both back to the U.S. and then, with your dad having worked on Sensodyne, I guess the dental side of things as well. So, there's obviously I think your story here is like a study in contrast, big and small, different countries and so on. Well, let's do one more contrast, which is medical versus dental. It always makes sense that on the one hand, dental, it's part of the body. It's right, it's right there. And at the same time, like the dental system is different from a reimbursement standpoint, and everything is different. Dentistry is not a specialty of medicine per se, although you still call your dentist a doctor. So what are some of the key differences between the medical and dental environments from your standpoint?
Yeah. And it's really fascinating, actually, with some of these, changes, and each time you take a fresh look and you're learning a new area. So I guess I can see it differently than someone who's been in dental their whole lives and make some of those contrasts. But, look, you've got the medical world, which is so formulaic, and not that the dentistry doesn't have its sort of, standards and guidelines and so forth. But I feel like, dentists are sort of part, physician, part entrepreneur, part capitalist, because they're running their own business, and they're not, reimbursement is a piece of what they do, but, reimbursement is sparse, incomplete, and certainly, not available to the entire, subset of their population. So they're tied to it, but they're not constrained by it. And I think they make, clinical decisions. They incorporate, sort of technologies. They look not only at the, the medical clinical side of things, but they're also looking at the monetary side. How am I going to make money on this? Is this going to bring in more patients to my practice? Am I going to be able to bill more, for this? What efficiencies do I gain, from it? So they have that sort of, business person's eye, but also the medical person's eye. I think there's a lot of other, similarities. There's the classic sort of dentist world was, they almost call them like drill and fill.
Yeah.
Because they just make a lot of money on filling cavities, and that's sort of the basic business of it. I think, now they're taking a little bit more of an introspective view of it. There's technologies that are coming out. There's trends emerging around more of a preventive, mindset. If I can see cavities earlier, and there's also sort of new treatments that are coming out that allow you to treat it and reverse it, like you mentioned at the outset. And so I think they're becoming, more minded to this. I'm particularly focusing in on a subsegment of dentistry and pediatric dentistry that I think for sure appreciates, this. And so it is, different, but very similar. And, you've got to pay attention to all the nuances and all the history, of the dentistry world and go to school on it pretty quickly.
So you're talking about, early detection, which is a feature across other areas of healthcare, including oncology, which you have been involved with before. But how are things, let's say, different for a child going to the dentist in the mid 2020s now compared to, let's say, when I was going in the early 70s, or what's how maybe it's not that different, but how is it possible for it to be different?
Yeah, I mean, again, I could take sort of two views of it and say, on a macro view, it's really not all that different, from, let's call it, when you and I were growing up, so to speak. I mean, it's still, the basics of it are cavity detection, and again, filling cavities. A lot of the techniques, and mechanisms and structures are still in place. I do think that slowly some technologies are emerging. Obviously X-rays. You remember when we were X-rays. It was a lot more sort of cumbersome to take X-rays. Now it's a lot easier to take X-rays. And kids are notorious. So one of the areas that we're working on are places where it's still difficult to get X-rays. So you have these kids who are under 6 years old. They have a strong gag reflex and they can't get the X-rays. You have a lot of special needs kids. You have kids with braces, where X-rays aren't particularly useful, because you have the bars, extending across the teeth.
Yeah.
And so there are still, sort of, areas where X-rays are, and also the reimbursement, right? And also the concerns about radiation. So even though X-rays are incredibly informative to the standard of care, they're not always available, either because of some of the constraints we earlier talked about, or because of the radiation concerns or reimbursement concerns if you're doing them more frequently. And then there's technologies, that kind of assist and aid in it. So you have AI, which is being implemented now when you do have X-rays, right? So I would say, interpretation of those images, is employing sort of new technologies. And there are other technologies using sort of dyes and luminescence and other ways to be able to sort of diagnose cavities, when and if you can't get access to it. But we still have an archaic system. So for example, you have mobile dentists and or hygienists going into schools and still just using visual inspection to be able to apply high fluoride, high density fluoride treatments or remineralization agents. But it does seem, relatively old fashioned. So it's new technologies emerging, but in pockets.
So looking at your website, CaviSense, it seems to have you have some sort of a toothpick or something like that. Is that what is that form factor?
Yeah, so the core of this technology, again, you mentioned it earlier, is around early cavity detection. Essentially, actually, what we're doing is an intermediate step. So it's you have, and this is, everybody knows this because we all have had cavities. Sadly, it's actually the largest, preventive disease, but most prevalent disease that's preventable. And so it starts with plaque, right? Bacteria that adheres to your teeth. When that bacteria, grows and gets to be either enough volume or harmful enough. So essentially, when it's fed sugar, it emits, lactic acid. That acid, when it gets, toxic enough, essentially will lower the pH on the surface of those teeth. And when it gets below a threshold of 5.5 on the pH scale, it starts to actively demineralize the teeth. And if that's left unchecked, right, all of that acid is ultimately going to erode the teeth and result in a cavity that'll have to be, restored and treated. And so we're right at that the middle step there. This notion of active demineralization. And so what we really are is a glorified pH meter that essentially changes color in a binary fashion. So it starts purple. When it hits a tooth surface that is less than 5.5, it turns bright yellow, so that a clinician can understand just by touching tooth surfaces, where there is not a cavity, because we can't tell you whether it's an early stage cavity or a late stage cavity, but we can tell you that it's moving towards a cavity. The dynamic, will ultimately result in a cavity. And likewise, if there's already a cavity in place, we can tell you whether it's getting worse or whether that cavity's been arrested, and stays purple instead of turning yellow. So that's essentially the technology. The form factor as a toothpick is great because the vast majority of cavities actually happens in between teeth, and those are hard to visualize. And so, this is a great compliment to sort of dentists and their efforts, because all you have to do is take a CaviSense toothpick, put it in between either a suspicious area or use it more as a screening tool, and you'll be able to tell, where the I wouldn't say specifically the cavities are, but where there are areas of active demineralization, that you need to intervene.
So the technology sounds really cool, and it sounds clinically useful. There are a lot of things in the medical and presumably dental environment as well that you could say that about, but the business model is tough. So I think a lot of things that were with prevention and early detection in general. If you said that dentists are making money on drill and fill, this sounds like it's a different approach. So is this going to be like great for the patient, but kill off the dentists, or how does it all work together?
Yeah, it's a critical question. So there is movement afoot, to submit a new what they call CDT code, not a CPT code, but within the ADA for early cavity detection, of which we fall into. Although that process may take a couple of years to get specific reimbursement in place. But I think, as we talked about earlier, dentists are a little bit less tied to sort of reimbursement classically than physicians are, classic physicians. And so what we have is an argument here, essentially, that if you're going to try the CaviSense toothpick on some suspicious lesions or areas, let's say maybe half of them will turn yellow. And once it turns yellow, you're going to do one of three things that are essentially money makers for a dentist. One is you're going to, implore the mother, to get an X-ray. And if they do get an X-ray, they make money on the X-ray. And if you can't get an X-ray, you're going to apply some form of an SDF, they call it high density fluoride or remin agent, to that area, because you now have reason to believe that it's going to head towards a cavity. And so that's also a money making opportunity. And then the last thing is, even if you do apply the remin agents, you're going to call that patient back on a more frequent basis, probably 3 months instead of every 6 months, to be able to monitor the progression of those identified areas. And of course, each visit in itself has money-making opportunities. So it's that kind of a dynamic. And thankfully, the technology that we're bringing to market is not only easy to use, but also, a consumable product. So it's roughly $3 a toothpick. If you use a couple of toothpicks during a visit, maybe you're talking about $10. It's our estimate that, on average, you're probably going to make a 5x return, on the basis of some of the events are likely to happen after a toothpick turns yellow. So that's sort of the rationale and the way you've got to, introduce this technology to clinicians.
Well, it sounds more robust than a typical startup business model. So I guess you've been around the block a little bit. Let's talk about where the company stands now and kind of what the plans are and what's the potential of this. Is this currently deployed? If I go to a pediatric dentist, are they going to be using it? How do you see scaling?
Yeah, so it's really at an interesting time. I've been at this company for about a year. We've stepped through a lot of milestones. We've fully developed the product. We've done some, clinical testing, some usability testing. We've registered the product with the FDA, and now we're, at the end of the process of sort of scaling up the manufacturing to make it more, widely available. We're actually going to the annual conference of pediatric dentists. It's called the AAPD. It's in Toronto at the end of this week. And there we're going to be really, sort of launching this product, introducing it to the target physicians. In the advent of that, we've done we've been to smaller conferences, and just through our own sort of mini launch efforts, we've put this product into the hands of 50 first users, who are actively working with it, and making purchases, of it. And, it's learning every day, in terms of how do they see it, how do they view it, how are they using it? What's sort of the reorder, percentages and so forth. So we're right in the midst of the story. I think generally speaking, the feedback that we've gotten has been excellent. And there will be uptake. I can't tell you if it's going to be, sort of huge and immediate or it'll take some time. But I think we're really encouraged. We also have a second product that's in development, leveraging the same technology. This is going to be more of a screening tool. So instead of a very sort of highly specific toothpick version for a single tooth surface, you're going to take a tray with a gel that you're going to bite down on and pull it out of your mouth, and you'll be able to see all the yellow spots. More of a screening tool. And if we can get the frictionless, use case properly, we're thinking about targeting this to consumers and doing more of a DTC approach, and selling this through pharmacies and things like that, and directly to users. And I think this touches on a really important point I'd like to make, which is not only because we've talked largely about the dentist, but I think the real opportunity is to get these technologies out of the dental office. We talk about home monitoring and so many other areas of medicine. There's really very little dental monitoring, going on, and consumers are just desperate for feedback in terms of their oral health practices and whether it's working or not, and what's happening in between visits. You could leave the dentist perfectly healthy, and then 6 months later they tell you have 5 cavities, and you sit there in shock. Whereas if you had some way to test yourself, you would have an idea about where things are heading, or if you knew you had some watch and wait sort of cavities, you could test them yourselves in the intervening period. And I think this would really move the field forward, with greater interactivity between the dentist and their users, outside of the dental office.
Well, that sounds like a great vision, Jordan, and the way you painted it makes it seem like it's coming true. So I wish you the very best with that. I want to conclude with a question I ask all my guests about, which is whether you've had a chance to read any good books lately, if there's anything that you might recommend to our listeners.
So I really enjoy reading quite a bit. I don't read, sort of nonfiction. I feel like, life is so full of it. And so I try to sort of use it as a bit of an escape. And so I've read a number of really good books, one of which is called The Book of Goose. It's actually takes place in France, about a burgeoning writer. But I tend to kind of just take the surefire ones off the shelf, the ones that have been well reviewed, have won all the prizes. It tends to de-risk reading for me, because there's nothing worse than picking up a book and not enjoying it and then having to sort of put it down and get another one. So that's my approach, but I tend to go through three or four a month and really enjoy it.
That's good. It is always hard to find a good book. I will say that. So if you have a tried and true methodology for it, that sounds good. Maybe a little toothpick you could put on to see if you're going to like it or not. In any case, my guest today has been Jordan Rubinson, CEO of CaviSense, focusing on early detection of cavities. Jordan, thanks so much for joining me today on the HealthBiz podcast.
Thank you, David.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com. You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.